The sky was so heavy that it almost suffocated the horse in the stable, his eyes staring at the advancing black clouds, like an army silent before the thunderclaps that shook the hills. The distant sound crashed down on the hard-packed earth of the farm, where Comanche, more than a horse, he was a shadow of something greater, a forgotten legend. But now, with scarred fur and a seemingly broken soul, all that remained of him was silence, making people afraid to come too close. Suddenly, the roar of an engine broke the gloom of the atmosphere. My dusty old pickup truck slowly moved forward. I gripped the steering wheel with white knuckles, my eyes on the road ahead, but my mind was stuck in the past. I hadn't set foot on that farm in years, since I lost my place in the army, my unit, and so much of myself. But here I am, all because of that horse. Stepping out of the truck, I felt the rain start to fall in thick drops that soaked my hat. Each footstep felt like I carried an invisible weight on my shoulders. I approached the corral slowly, and there he was, Comanche, my old partner who'd saved my life more times than I could count. But when I looked into his eyes, it felt like a dagger to my heart. His gaze was hollow, empty. It was as if he no longer knew me at all. "Comanche," I whispered. My voice was barely audible, and my chest tightened with emotion. I reached out a hand, praying he'd give me some sign of recognition. Instead, he backed away a few steps, letting out a soft whinny, as if I was just a stranger. My throat felt like it was closing up. I had expected this reunion to be hard, but not this painful. From a short distance, I noticed a young ranch hand, Sophie, watching. She walked over cautiously. "He doesn't trust anyone," she said, her voice gentle. "Especially men. Something happened to him." I knew exactly what had happened. The same horrors that haunted me had also scarred Comanche. The difference was that he couldn't put his trauma into words. It was etched into his body and his behaviors. The rain intensified, soaking everything around us, and I just stood there, breathing heavily. I turned back to Comanche and muttered under my breath, "I can't fail you." Not again. Rain pelted the fences and turned the ground to mud. I stared at him with a mix of pain and determination, wondering if he could still sense me behind his guarded eyes, or if it was too late for both of us. Memories surged in my mind. A night that felt just like this, only in a desert halfway across the world. Gunfire, screaming, heat so stifling it robbed you of breath. Comanche was there beside me, drenched in sweat, eyes wild yet unwavering. We survived together, faced the impossible. Now it felt like that bond had been severed by time and suffering. "You're not like this," I said, my voice trembling. Guilt weighed me down. "I failed you. And everyone else." I stepped back, wiping my face, not sure if the water streaming down was the rain or my own tears. Sophie was about to approach, but she saw something in my expression that made her stop. I must have looked like a man bearing a burden far too heavy. Comanche let out another soft whinny. That single sound cut through me more deeply than words ever could. It told me he was as haunted by the past as I was, both of us trapped in a cycle of trauma. Maybe that was why we found our way back together, two survivors trying to piece ourselves back together from the wreckage. The storm grew worse, wind howling as if trying to remind me of all the chaos inside my own head. But I wouldn't back down. "I'll make you remember," I said, firmer this time. Even if he had no recognition now, I knew deep inside that our connection was still there. I just needed to find it before it slipped away for good. Morning arrived, cold and clear, but the heaviness in the ranch air remained. I'd spent the night in a small cabin meant for temporary workers, though I barely slept. Visions of the past kept me awake. The thunder of explosions, the screams of soldiers, and Comanche galloping beside me through a storm of bullets. By dawn, I walked back to the pen, Comanche stood like a statue, staring at nothing. Not even fresh food and water from Sophie had tempted him. I recognized the look in his eyes. It was the same fear that had once consumed me. "I know what you're feeling," I murmured, leaning against the fence. My voice was low, filled with emotion. "Like you're still over there. Like you'll never really leave." I let out a hollow laugh. "Guess neither of us truly did, huh?" Sophie came by, carrying some hay. She looked at me curiously. "You seem to know this horse well," she said softly. I turned away from her gaze. "He saved my life. More than once." The weight of that admission hung between us. I didn't want to say more. Not yet. I decided to try another approach. Carefully, I stepped into the pen. Comanche's ears perked up in alert, but he didn't run. I crouched down, putting myself at his eye level. "Do you remember?" I asked, my voice shaking. "The fields? The nights that never seemed to end? Me?" I pulled out a small piece of worn leather, part of the equipment Comanche used to wear in combat. His eyes flickered for a moment with recognition, then returned to that guarded emptiness. The pang of disappointment hit me hard. Maybe he was trying as hard to forget it as I once had. Time seemed to stretch on as we stood there in a silent standoff, me holding that piece of leather like a key to locked memories. But his gaze was unyielding. Frustrated, I stepped back and ran a hand through my messy hair. I had hoped this would crack the barrier between us, but Comanche's trauma went deeper than I imagined, maybe even deeper than mine. Sophie, watching from afar, finally approached. "You know this isn't going to be easy," she said, crossing her arms. "He has more scars than any horse I've seen. Some things, maybe they just can't be fixed." My eyes flashed stubbornly. "He's not beyond repair," I insisted. "I've seen his heart. That doesn't just disappear." I inched closer to Comanche again, but I didn't force anything. I just stood, letting him sense my presence. Then it happened. Something so small most people would miss it. Comanche turned his head a little as if acknowledging me. My heart pounded. It was a tiny crack in the wall between us, but I was grateful for it. That subtle movement felt like a lifeline. I stayed as still as possible, afraid to break the moment. The wind rustled through nearby trees, adding weight to the silence. For the first time in years, I didn't feel so alone with the invisible weight I carried. "You're still there, aren't you, boy?" I asked quietly. Vulnerability tinged my voice. Sophie approached slowly with a bucket of water. "I've never seen him react like this," she said. "Maybe you really do mean something to him?" She sounded unsure but curious. I took a deep breath. "He saved me when no one else could," I said, my voice cracking at the memory. We were surrounded in a valley. I thought I was done for, but he charged right into the smoke and fire to get me out. I paused, remembering the chaos. I promised him I'd never leave him behind. And then I did. Comanche shifted his head again, as if some part of him recognized my words. He took a single step forward, and my heart nearly leapt. It was just one step, but it was enough to give me hope. He suddenly stopped, bowing his head. The connection almost vanished in that moment, but instead of pushing him, I knelt down in the mud, meeting his gaze. "You don't have to be scared anymore," I said gently. Then a helicopter roared in the distance. I froze because I knew it wasn't just a noise, it was a trigger. Comanche's ears shot forward, and he let out the loudest, most terrified whinny I'd heard from him. Suddenly, he was circling the pen, tail lashing, as if he was back on the battlefield. Sophie rushed to the fence. "He's losing it. Do something," she yelled. But I held up a hand. "Comanche, listen to me," I called, stepping toward the pen's center. My hands were open in a calming gesture. "You're safe now. It's over. It's over, boy. For a moment, Comanche still trembled, panting as if he'd just galloped through war-torn streets. Then something shifted. He looked at me, confusion and recognition mingling in his eyes. Slowly, he stepped forward until he stood right in front of me. My hand shook as I reached out and placed it gently on his forehead. "We're in this together," I whispered. In that instant, I realized I wasn't just helping Comanche. I was confronting my own ghosts. He didn't pull away. His breathing began to slow, the terrified glint in his eyes softening. Relief washed over me. "You remember me, don't you?" I asked, voice full of equal parts hope and sorrow. Yet I knew this fragile moment of recognition wouldn't erase the years of suffering for either of us. Comanche was a mirror, reflecting the trauma I'd tried to bury. But staring at him, I realized I couldn't run anymore. Sophie's voice broke through my thoughts. "How do you do it?" "He barely lets anyone near him." She trailed off, struggling to find the right words. I pulled back, giving Comanche some space. "It's not magic," I said quietly. "It's pain. Pain connects us in ways others don't understand. He feels what I carry, and I feel what he carries." Comanche began to move around the pen again, calmer but still alert. I watched him closely. That was when I noticed a stiffness in his hind leg. He was limping, and it sent a spike of concern through me. "He's hurt," I told Sophie. "It's not just emotional. There's something else going on." She nodded. "I'll call the vet." "No," I cut in, raising a hand. "If he really does remember me, I'm the one he'll trust. Let me handle it." Sophie hesitated, then nodded and stepped back, leaving me alone with Comanche. I took a deep breath, fully aware that to help him, I'd have to face my own demons too. I grabbed a bucket of clean water and a cloth, then entered the pen slowly. Comanche flicked his ears in warning, but he didn't flee. "Easy, boy," I murmured, crouching beside his hind leg. "I'm not gonna hurt you." Gently, I wiped away the mud, checking for any cuts or swelling. He let out a sharp whinny, almost catching me with a hoof. I eased back, heart pounding. I know. "It hurts," I whispered. As I worked, I started talking, maybe to Comanche, maybe just to the open air. "I should have come back for you," I said, guilt lining every word. "I should have fought harder to get you out of that place, but I was so broken. They told me you disappeared in the chaos. I believed them because it was easier than admitting I failed you." Comanche lowered his head slightly, his eyes flicking toward me as though he understood. Standing up, I exhaled shakily. "But I'm here now, and we're gonna fix this. You saved me too many times, Comanche. Now it's my turn." After a thorough check, I spotted some swelling in his hoof, an old injury never properly tended to. With time and patience, it could heal. When I finally finished, I stroked his neck gently. This time, he didn't shy away. It was another step forward, a tiny victory that lit a spark of hope in my chest. That evening, I stood outside the enclosure, watching the sunset cast warm hues over the ranch. Comanche moved more calmly now, but there was still a distance between us, an emotional barrier that felt like a gulf. I slipped my hand into my pocket and felt a small metal bell, something I'd found among my old belongings. That bell once symbolized survival in the harshest times. Now I hoped it could be a symbol of reconnection. Sophie noticed my pensive look and walked over. "Are you okay?" she asked, placing a gentle hand on my shoulder. I nodded, but kept my gaze on Comanche. "It's strange," I admitted, being so close to him, yet feeling like we're miles apart. "Why does he mean so much to you?" she asked quietly. I took a moment before answering. "He saved my life, over and over, and I promised never to leave him." The gravity of my words surprised even me. Sophie looked as though she understood more than she let on. As we spoke, Comanche inched closer to the fence, watching us with a curious but cautious expression. Sophie smiled. I think he's starting to trust again. I knew the road would be long, but it was good to see that small change. The next morning, at dawn, I walked to the enclosure with the bell in hand. Shaking it gently, I let its metallic chime ring out. Comanche lifted his head, ears swiveling at the familiar sound. Step by careful step, he approached me, eyes reflecting both recognition and hesitation. My heart tightened. You remember this, don't you? I whispered, trying to control the surge of emotion. The bell had once been our lifeline in the field, a signal we were still alive and fighting. Now it was a promise that maybe we could rebuild something that once felt unbreakable. I moved to an old training ground overgrown with weeds. Comanche followed at a distance. The place was heavy with memories. For both of us, I suspected. I shook the bell again, its sound weaving through the quiet air like an echo of the past. Comanche froze, ears perked, staring at the bell. Slowly, he stepped closer, almost touching it with his nose. I let the bell drop to the ground, its clang muted in the dirt. My voice trembled. I left you behind, Comanche. Thought I was doing what was best, that you'd be safe without me. But the truth is, I was scared of what we lost and what it would mean to come back. I took a shaky breath. I'm here now, and we can move forward, together. Comanche lifted his head and looked me in the eye. In that moment, I felt something shatter, a hidden wall that had separated us. He let out a soft whinny, and I recognized it as acceptance. Reaching out, I placed my hand on his forehead, feeling the old connection spark back to life. It was as if a weight lifted from both of us. Sophie arrived soon after, lingering a short distance away with a quiet smile. She didn't need words to express what had just transpired. We both knew something fundamental had changed. Comanche and I had found each other again, and in that moment, I felt the embers of hope reignite. By dusk, Comanche and I walked side by side across the open field, just as we had in the old days. It wasn't just a stroll, it was a new beginning. Neither of us could erase the past, but we no longer had to be prisoners of it. In the silence we shared, we found something more precious than memory, the strength to move forward, no longer alone.